Nintendo bails on coinop. Sega teams up with Sony. And sound card pioneer Adlib bites the dust. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time 40, 30, and 20 years to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industry of yesteryear. I'm your host, Carl, and on this journey back 30 years to July of 1992, I am joined by a voice very familiar to listeners of the show, but a first-time co-host, Ethan. Welcome to the show, Ethan.
Hey, Carl. I'm escaped from the Department of Corrections, and I have come to join the show.
You know, that sounds far, far more evil than it should. But, exactly. So, you are jumping into the co-host seat for the very first time.
Yes,
Are
we
you
almost
excited?
did this once.
This is true.
One time, Peter was almost out for a recording session, and he got in back at the last second. But now I am here, sitting in the hot seat, exactly where Carl will be when we get to the Department of Corrections.
There you go. So, this is part of my yearly catch-up-a-thon. For those listening in real time, this is late August, and we're still doing July episodes. So over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be trying to pop out at least 2 episodes a week. Let's see if I can manage that. That's the goal.
Boy, oh
I'm not saying
boy.
it's going to work. But we will be recording these at a very brisk pace over the next few weeks. So brace yourselves, everybody. Lots for your ear satisfaction. Okay,
Your ear satisfaction.
You know, I almost went with Kevin Smith's whole, ear pussy thing, and I decided, I'm not going to infringe on that.
Okay, let's move on. Let's
So-
let's get out from that.
Hey, come on. The guy's made a career out of being a podcaster, especially when movies didn't really work. So, I shouldn't say that because I love both his podcasts and his movies. But, let's move on from that. So, as everybody knows, on the show we go back and look at headlines from publications dated the month that we're visiting, in this case July 1992. So, of course, as always, the disclaimer, please don't send me any emails. I know that the news happened at some point before that. It's just a convention for organizing the episodes.
I do wonder who that is directed at. Who are those
I
people?
have received emails in the past from people being very upset that it was like, no, that actually happened in May, not July. I know that because obviously the news takes a while to get through to the magazines. There's going to be a few examples, some really good examples of this actually next episode for the 20-year jump. But, I had to figure out a way of organizing the show as a whole, and I just decided to go with this. I mean, there's actually going to be a couple of stories. There's a couple stories in this episode where we have some overlap, where there's going to be notices in one magazine that almost contradict notices in another magazine just because they both had the cover date July 1982. That doesn't mean that they both came out even in the same month.
And this is why it is also fraught to try and date games based on when they appeared, when the advertisement appeared in a publication.
And that is a wonderful segue because our next segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where the co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated July 1992 that they have never played before for 7 minutes and then tell us all about it, actually features a game that this exact thing happened to. But that's something we're going to get into in just a moment when we get deeper into the 7 Minutes in Heaven segment. So, before we do that, just real quick, remember everybody, you can find links to everything that we're talking about in the show notes. You can also support us on Patreon, follow us on Twitter, blah, 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 blah. All the links are in the show notes. And if you want to watch the video version of our 7 Minutes in Heaven segment, that is available only for the Patreon patrons. So,
Yes.
fuck a
Want to
month,
see
it's
our
your
beautiful faces as we react like those YouTube channels.
Exactly, but we only do it for 10 minutes or 7 minutes because we know how annoying that is, and we don't plan on forcing that on anybody else. So if you want to pay for the privilege of not only supporting the show with the cost of hosting and all that good rot, but also getting to watch that wonderful extra goodies and as well as get early access to our interview episodes, jump over there. Now, we had a lot of games to choose from this month. I mean, Ethan could have been playing such wonderful titles as Legend, great one, or the Ocean semi-classic Epic, or Dune, the original game, or Degeneration, or Risky Woods, or some real stinkers like Wings 2 on Super NES. But instead, we've gone with a bit of an oddball choice, and actually one of two games released by Sensible Software, or I should say games by Sensible Software that were reviewed this month. And that is the 1992 follow-up to their classic game Whizball, Whiz Kid. So, Ethan, are you ready for your 7 Minutes in Heaven?
As ready as I can be.
Excellent. Then let's go to it. Welcome back from your 7 Minutes in Heaven, Ethan. So, for the uninitiated, based on your 7 minutes with the game, how would you describe WizKid?
How would you describe WizKid is the real question. There's arcade action, and there's puzzle, and there's platforming and things. So I made a comparison that Carl wasn't necessarily on board with, but I stick by, that it is very much like a lot of old Flash games, where they kind of throw a bunch of ideas together, having a sort of unifying theme, in this case kind of through a character that has several different parts to him. You start off as a head that can bash bricks, and you're supposed to destroy enemies before you run out of bricks, and you have a couple other abilities that go along with that, and then eventually you become a character with a body, and you wander around and solve puzzle platformy things that way.
Okay. I don't think that gives a really good description of what is actually happening in the game. So you're just this free-floating head, correct?
Green free-floating head.
Okay. Now, this big question here. You have not played the original Whizball game that preceded this one.
No, sir.
Okay. Now, so this game is the sequel to that. That game was one of the early successes, not the earliest success, but early success for Sensible Software. And this was this game got very mixed reviews because, it's just odd. The artwork is, I would say, uncoordinated is maybe a good way of describing it. It just seems like there's a lot of...
But I would say one thing that it has above most games developed in Britain is it feels good. They have a really nice way of giving you kind of reaction to what you're doing. You start off as this disembodied head, you hit these bricks, and you need to destroy these enemies that pop up on screen. And it's kind of a puzzle to figure out how to eliminate them. And the bricks have certain properties. If it kills one particular enemy, it continues to bounce for a while until it goes off screen. So things kind of change up in the middle depending on how you approach it with the strategy.
Gotcha. And that is true. I mean, it really does move well. It's got an extremely good frame rate. To
be fair, it is a late Amiga game. So there is
No,
that.
this isn't late. Late
92?
would probably be 94 or so. I mean,
no, this is Amiga came out in 85, discontinued 94. Nothing beyond that even counts, Carl.
Well, you also have to remember up until very, very recently, so up until 90, 91, there are virtually or very, very few Amiga games. Almost all the games on the Amiga are straight ports or only slightly improved ports of the Atari ST versions. The ST has finally bitten the big one, and now we're finally seeing games developed exclusively for the Amiga.
It is still a late Amiga release.
This is true. Well, I mean, the Amiga 1200 hasn't even hit this store.
But
shelf.
it's still the Amiga, Carl. Anyways.
Yes. Okay.
So, I think that it has a certain play value, and I have played another Sensible Software game for 7 Minutes in Heaven on this show before, Cannon Fodder, we did for the great anniversary special. You should go watch that. And there's definitely commonalities. It's where you can really see, even though they are entirely different games that have basically nothing in common, they still share the Sensible Software feel.
And this is very true, and that real sense of control goes all the way back to the original Whizball and games like Micro Pro Soccer, which was also theirs. And this month, 2 games of theirs from different publishers are being reviewed. Sensible Soccer, which is probably their biggest success, also gets reviewed this month. And Ocean was actually going to delay the actual release of WizKid, even though it's getting reviewed already, because they have a couple other big games already in the pipeline, including Epic, which they had put a lot of hopes into being their big, huge savior game. And that had been delayed for like 2 years, and it basically doesn't really go anywhere. So this is why WizKid does get a little bit delayed in its actual release. The reviews come out. Some magazines really loved it. They really engaged with the oddness of it. Others basically just threw their hands in the air going like, no. And it does take a while. I didn't play it a lot back in the day. I only played it briefly back in the day. I played it for probably about 40, 50 minutes now before we record it again. And I have to say, the longer you spend with it, the more you become familiar with the mechanics, the physics of the bricks that bounce around and stuff start to become more ingrained in you, and you actually start to be able to predict where everything's going to bounce a lot better. And the strategies, there's a lot of bugs flying around that you have to hit. You can really start to build some interesting chains and stuff with the material that's on the screen. So
certainly the core gameplay could have made for a good arcade game.
Yeah.
And that's probably the best compliment that you can ever give to an Amiga game, for they never get above that.
Ooh. Oh, all I know is if you have to keep doing 7 Minutes in Heaven, I know which jumps I'm putting you in and which games you're going to have to play.
Carl is nothing if not obsessed with the
Amiga. I'm actually more obsessive with the C64 than the Amiga, but I do have a soft spot in my heart for the very experimental nature of the games that appeared in the 16-bit home computer
I
era.
Also, I feel for that. In the console realm, I think that the GameCube is way more interesting than the generation that comes afterwards, where they refined everything and everything pretty much plays, there is simplifying. So the reason I like the GameCube, Xbox, PS2 generation is they had figured out enough to make things playable, but they hadn't figured out enough to know what the mechanics were that everybody was going to use. I believe I've said this in the past.
I can respect that. I can definitely respect that, and I have a very soft spot for that generation as well. I do think, though, that one of the things that's missing that the next generation does have is basically, and this is pretty much exclusively the Xbox 360, is the Xbox Arcade experience, which allowed for shorter games to exist.
But nowadays, you can't even go back and do that. So, there's always evolution. There's always good things that come with the forward evolution.
I agree. I mean, the digital marketplace allowed for a new type of experience on console, which is very familiar to computer gamers because not every game needs to be a 60-hour epic. And sometimes you just want to have those relatively short experiences that are really, really good, really, really fun. But if you played it for 4 hours straight, you would probably get bored of it. And that is really where a lot of these small, almost non-professional developers on systems like the Amiga really could shine, could make these interesting, weird, quirky experiences. But
the ecosystems definitely drive what can be done with the games. But at the same time, there is a lot, I rail against the British games for a reason. Most of them just don't have a good core feeling, but WizKid does. It has its quirkiness, and it has its interesting way of drawing you into the world. The story of Whizball too. There's another game that did a subtitle like that. But as for WizKid, I would say it is definitely worth a look, at least for maybe 20 minutes at least, and then feel it out from there.
Exactly. Okay, good. So recommendation then, you would say at least 20 minutes?
Yeah, it is definitely worth the 7, and give it a little time, and I think you'll see basically what the game has to offer, and you can go from there.
Excellent. So now, with that being closed off, we have one more segment we have to look at before we can turn on the time machine.
Who is it, Carl?
And this is where we have to look at that cold-hearted, black-souled, or what was the famous legal phrase, corkscrew-souled man who runs the Department of Corrections.
That guy.
Our good friend Ethan, to find out what I got wrong in our June 1992 jump.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, before we can find out what I got wrong in June of 1992, we have...
I forget who was the host on this thing. I can't remember. I did not write a comment. I was too engrossed with my other corrections.
Let me check and see. I gotta check.
You don't even remember. You don't remember, Carl.
I have to check the game. Because the game will tell me who it was. It was Chris.
Okay. Chris.
And the game was Going Ape Spit. Oh, the Toki, the Genesis version of Toki.
Oh, yeah. I remember now. So, welcome, Chris. That's all I have to say. Now we get into the punching match. June 1992. Carl, show me your left cheek.
I shall show you my left cheek. So
I don't want to see what he's doing on the camera right now.
Yeah, you didn't say it had to be my face cheek.
You're ruining the joke now. Okay, we'll go on. First up, the company was called High Tech Expressions, not High Tech Software.
Oh, okay.
They went through a number of names, but at the time they were High Tech Expressions.
Gotcha.
Then we have the Nintendo Seal of Quality was the name of their little badge.
Okay. What did I call it?
I don't remember.
Sea of Tranquility? Okay, whatever.
Then, Turbo Technologies, the company that took over for the TurboGrafx stuff, it was not a subsidiary of NEC. And I went and actually checked this on the California Office database. There's no indication that it was a subsidiary of NEC. It was a partnership of assets from NEC and Hudson.
Okay. So, but we don't know who are the equity owners.
We don't know the full shakeout of that, but I highly doubt that it was a subsidiary of NEC in that sense. We don't know exactly, why they did this. It was probably a tax thing that they were shuttling it off into this, but either way.
A tax thing, and they did not want to get, have the mother company sued when the whole thing went belly up, and they left people in the lurch who had either ordered stuff.
Yeah, but Turbo Technologies also persisted for a good long time. They seemed like they thought they had some sort of chance.
Ah, okay, cool.
Then, next up, we return once again to the Nintendo Sony Fallout thing. So, Nintendo and Sony were still in talks to resolve the CD-ROM add-on thing as of 1992 and even 1993. We don't know a lot about the specifics of this. It is reported in some places, and, there's a whole lot of mythology around this, but they were still trying to go back and forth, still trying to find a resolution of some kind. So in that sense, it was not absolutely certain that Nintendo was never going to do a CD-ROM add-on, quote-unquote, you saying vaporware.
Well, yeah, but I'm not talking about the Sony one. I'm talking about the Philips one.
No, in this context, you were talking about the Sony thing, but also with the Philips thing, in 1993, they had a spec, and that spec has been found.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Did it involve all the extra chips and stuff?
Yeah, I needed to go and look at it again. I remember we talked about this before. Yeah. I have not looked at it and seen specifically if they were going to do that.
Yeah, because that, for me, what it feels like, it's like every time there's a little bit of buzz around the Mega CD or whatever, they just keep coming out with a bigger, better spec sheet. And, I'd love to know just how close they got and how much of the promises they were making were realistic.
I think you're saying that Nintendo's playing 4D chess, and I don't think that's true.
Okay. Cool. I'd love to see that spec sheet. If you can get me a link to it, I'd love to see that.
I'll have to dig it up somewhere. I know Chris Kohler has it, so.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay, then next up we have a company conflation. Matsushita is Panasonic. It's a rename.
Okay, I thought Panasonic was a sub-brand of Matsushita.
Nope. Matsushita is Panasonic.
Okay.
I forget exactly when they do the rename, but yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Sounds cool. Yeah, because I knew Gold Star was a sub-brand as well. I just thought Panasonic was in that same category, but that's very good to know.
Then Dark Castle, the game that was ported to a million different systems, and nobody knows why. It is neither an EA nor an Accolade game, as you suspected. EA published the Genesis version, but they did not create the original on the Mac.
Oh, okay. But they just kept spreading that nightmare to all the systems they could find.
Yeah, it was ill-advised.
Oh my god, it's so ill-advised. Have you ever played it?
No, but I have seen every single version of it.
Oh, it looks terrible, but it controls even worse. If that's even possible. Sorry, yeah.
It was an early attempt to continue what Karateka had left us. It's the Prince of Persia before Prince of Persia, and fails horribly.
No, yeah. If that's what they were going for. Ooh, talk about missing the mark. Okay, but that's another issue entirely.
And finally, we get to your most dystopian, dreaded idea of all time, Carl. How you think the multiverse could work. And all I have to say is, It's horrid. Don't ever say that again.
I don't even remember which multiverse we were talking about.
You were saying that, like, oh, you were comparing it to a novel. I know I've heard, or a comic book. I know I've heard of this comic book before, with all the multiple worlds and whatnot, and then each world is its own game. And it's like, the idea of the multiverse is to trap you into an ecosystem, and that's not. No, stop, Carl. Stop feeding it.
Okay, I honestly don't even remember the context of this anymore, so I'm just going to say I won't do that again, officer, no matter what it was that I did.
There you go, Department of Corrections, stamped. You are dismissed. We will see you next time for June 2002.
Excellent.
You know, that guy sounded kind of cool.
Yeah, I do have a voice for radio. Oh, you meant Ethan.
Yeah. Whereas he has a voice for the stage.
Yeah, but a face for radio.
Oh, so, you're really going there, Carl? Really need to go there.
What can I say as I sit here stroking my very manly beard? Yes. Or something. Okay. That was a weird, surreal experience now, having you here as co-host and in the Department of Corrections.
Yeah.
But, and of course, we record those at 2 different times, so it's all fun. Now, let's turn on the time machine for what will no doubt be a error-free episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine and head back to July of 1992.
Sega CD. 1992. Joystick to a whole new world.
Welcome back to July of 1992. Ethan, what's our first headline? Oh, I've been here. I've been to July 1992. I remember it well. It was a good time.
Playmeter warns coinmen of the coming home invasion.
Playmeter's Scott Wolf warns that CES in Chicago was packed with the kind of games for the home that should make every coin-op operator scared. From licensed classics like Pac-Man, Chase HQ, and Marble Madness to current coin drop kings like T2, Captain America, and the Big Kahuna Street Fighter II. The home systems are quickly catching up to the historically superior coin-op experience. He even warns that pinball is not safe, lauding the marvel that is Pinball Dreams on the Amiga.
Of course, this has been a long-standing issue for the coin-op operators. I actually wrote a blog post on said topic. This goes back to the late 1970s, where they were concerned about the fact that Atari, in particular, was putting their coin-op games on the VCS.
And when I interviewed Jim Trucano, he said exactly the same thing. When the Atari came out, they already knew video games were basically had a time limit on them as far as being the main driver of coin-op profits.
But I want to push back against that, because the arcade still could have worked if it had pivoted into a different sort of experience. I mean, it did pivot and it went to Redemption and whatnot. But I don't think that it was like as soon as home games emerged, we were done for. I mean, I've heard this from many people in the coin-op industry, and they even think that like when it went down in the early 80s, that was because of the home, and it really wasn't. Just to be clear about that. But I don't like doomerism as a general concept, but I think that it's a little bit overblown. That purely because they had better, they had comparable graphics, I should say, that it was inevitable that there was going to be no reason to go to the arcade. I think they needed to change their strategy in some pretty fundamental ways.
I agree, and one of those fundamental ways is already on the way because Sega has already announced, and we talked about this on the show a few months back, they've already announced that they're working on 3D hardware. And we've seen some 3D coming, but once 3D shows up, that's basically going to put the arcade another generation ahead of the home consoles again, at least for a couple of years until the PlayStation hits.
Yes, the gap was not nearly as extended as they would have hoped for something like that. But, that's the evolving pace of technology, lots of things running in parallel. And I don't think that the video game arcade necessarily had to go away and, what it might be trying to do now. I think that there is a fundamental difference between playing Street Fighter at home and Street Fighter in the arcade.
Well, in the arcade, yes, but also remember, Playmeter is talking to the coinop operators, and there's a lot more operators putting games in 7-Elevens than there are arcade operators.
Yes.
So from a sheer numbers game, you've got a whole bunch of these guys who are just putting them in an everyday location. For them, this is an existential threat.
Yes.
I think it's different for the arcade where you can go and they've got 50 machines set up that, you can't get at home, or for a kid who has a very limited budget that may only be able to afford 2, maximum 3 games a year. Maybe, of course, they can rent some stuff out from Blockbuster, but having the plethora of games and that high quality in a public setting with the social interaction elements that can also come from being in the arcade is different. And the arcade is a different thing, but I think who he's talking to here are those operators that are going by once a week to empty the cash box in a Street Fighter 2 unit at a 7-Eleven. Those people, they should probably be scared.
Yeah, I mean, as history turned out, that it was the case.
Yeah.
I still think that there was a place even for location owners like that. I mean, even today, in random places where I used to work, we had a gumball pinball machine that would bring down the gumball, and you had to bat it up into the thing to get it. And that guy, and I did talk to that guy, and he said, "Yeah, I do get a decent collection on this over time." But of course, with video games in coin-op, it stopped being a long-term investment thing because it was framed as a technology thing. True.
And you see this, and there's actually an ad in the back of either Playmeter or Replay this month. I can't remember which one, but they're actually advertising an add-on board for Ms. Pac-Man that changes up the layout and changes up the pace of the enemies and stuff. Now, this is a game that is 10 years old at this point. But one of the bits in the ad is that they're talking about how this is, the evergreen game that keeps making money, and you want it to keep making money into the future, blah, blah, blah. So I think that there was probably a real market or a niche for these older titles that had longevity as something that people would occasionally or randomly drop a quarter into. They weren't going to be big money makers, but since you had already purchased them back in the day, those could still be earners at this point in time in those random locations without having to constantly upgrade them to the latest game.
And that's how it used to work before video games came in.
Exactly.
A pinball machine would last years. And
yes.
As a steady earner, it wouldn't earn the big bucks. It would have a peak at the beginning and then would kind of gradually go off, but you would still be earning from it at a consistent enough pace that you wouldn't get rid of it.
And this is something we talked about in our last episode, the 40-year jump to 1982, where there was a survey from one of the trade publications on how often operators were buying and selling equipment, and then we talked about that distinction between the replacement rate of things like pool tables versus video games, and it was an astronomical multiplier. So video games, you had to constantly be buying new ones or replacing them, whereas something like a pool table, you Basically, it just sat there for years and years and years, and you did minimal maintenance on it.
But of course, there was another way that they were attempting to keep video game cabinets relevant for an extended period of time. But there's some bad news on that front, Carl.
Oh, yes, there is. The next headline, please.
Nintendo scales down coin-op operations.
With the Super NES-based Super System arcade hardware apparently not setting the world on fire, despite a cover story in this month's Play Meter, news has been broken in competing coin-op trade publication Replay that Nintendo has decided to scale down their arcade operations after Nintendo of Japan did not care for their approach. Al Stone, co-founder of Nintendo of America and head of the arcade division, has resigned, as have 5 regional reps. The company promises to continue to support the Super System, but new software may be coming from third parties.
So I talked to a guy who was here right when the coin-op thing closed. He was a longtime coin guy named Chuck Arnold. He was working as, I believe, one of those regional reps under Al Stone. And what he recalled specifically is that they were sitting in for the annual sales report, and I think he said Nintendo had just hit over $1 billion in consumer sales. And I was like, he was, a little bit worried how that would shake out for the arcade operation. Al Stone told him, no, things are going to be fine. And then the following year, they decide to exit.
Yeah. And I think, did you ever play one of the Super Systems?
I have not.
Okay. My recollection of the controller is it sucked. The arcade cabinet...
I don't take your opinions on controllers.
Yes. I know we have a long-standing feud on the GameCube controller, but no, this really did suck. It was an uncomfortable thing to play. I remember seeing one, I believe it was a bowling alley in Bellevue, Washington, back around this time period. And I think it had Mario World, and it may have had Super Tennis running on it, which, are not 2 games that you probably want to have in an arcade. It's not an arcade experience game. And Super Tennis maybe a little bit more, but they're clearly not bringing their best titles to this. And there's just not the kind of arcade experience Super NES games that the NES had that could keep the, Play 10?
Play Choice 10.
Play Choice 10 type of machines running.
Because to be clear about this, they do not modify these games other than setting a timer on them.
Yeah. It's exactly the same game you would play at home on a Super Nintendo. And the games that were coming out at this point for the Super NES, maybe with the exception of Final Fight Guy, or just Final Fight it was called, just aren't the type of games that you're going to be playing in an arcade. They're just not arcadey games at this early stage of the U.S. Super NES life.
And something that people forget about is that Nintendo in Japan had stopped making arcade games a long time ago. Their last release for the Versus system, which I don't like, it's a little confusing whether or not they even put it out, but it was Versus Super Mario Brothers, which I think was February 1986.
Oh, wow. That is very, very far back.
They stopped. America basically was telling them, no, they were just starting up the NES operation, so they needed a consistent revenue stream, so they begged them to keep doing it. They were more successful in America. The VS system was extremely popular. The Play Choice 10, it was good. It didn't. I don't think it made nearly as much money as the stuff from the Versus system. And they had some incredibly good people who were running the coin-op division. And not to say that Al Stone was not a good leader. He will later go on to Sega and then continue to run their operation very successfully. You'll get to that when you get there. Yeah. But he, was not necessarily as good as the people who came before him in terms of keeping that idea vibrant and alive. People like Frank Ballou and Bill Cravens, who later go on to do some very successful things with system hardware at other companies like Capcom.
Yeah, and I think that there's also this underlying tension, and it shows up in a lot of the editorials and even the letters pages of the trade magazines around this time. There's an inherent tension between what we just talked about, the fear of the coin-op operator of the home consoles killing their business, and at the same time, well, I'm making money off of these carts in a cabinet, but aren't I just also advertising the competition?
I don't think that was necessarily that big of a concern. And, I think that I think it wasn't really that effective in marketing terms. There are a couple isolated examples, like when they did the early release of Super Mario Bros. 3 on PlayChoice 10, but I don't think that it was necessarily that big of a driver for people to be aware that, there's a new Nintendo game and you can play it early in the arcades. I think most people who were aware of Nintendo games were not old enough to go into a lot of arcades. And that didn't really matter.
Well, I mean, my experience, I don't recall ever seeing one of those in an arcade. I'd see them either in bowling alley side rooms or where I saw at least 3 of them in the Seattle area were in pizza places, pizza parlors.
Yeah, the system
they were
hardware,
super popular there.
Right, that I think I mean this sort of generally when I say arcade. I should know better. I should know better of all people.
You should.
To not generalize as saying arcade. Neo Geo especially was still extremely popular even after the big productive life of the system. But technology is technology, and it didn't really. If you had a Super Nintendo at home, I don't think you were really that enticed by the fact that there was Super Nintendo games in the arcade that you could play that you didn't own.
This is very true.
In a street location.
Well, especially also with the Blockbuster question settled, renting games also wasn't a problem. So I think that also made a huge difference. Now, just as a side note, before we move on to the next story, only 12 games do get released for the system, and at this point, as far as I can tell, maybe 1 or 2 have already been released. So when they said that more support for the system is coming, it's pretty much already at the max. There's not going to be anything else significant coming out. So yes, the Super System is all but dead.
And Nintendo would continue to have a relationship with the arcade even up to the present day, mainly through Namco in particular.
Well, they'll come back, but it's going to be another 10 years before that happens.
But as we roll along on the technology train, we get to check in with some technology patent case news.
Oh, yes. Exciting. The lawyer in me is very happy.
Sega loses in big patent case.
They lose a big patent case, and they lose big in that patent case. Jan Coyle, and I think I'm pronouncing the name right, an inventor who, together with Robert Stevens, got a patent for the control of colors on screens back in 1975 using audio signals, has sued Sega, Nintendo, Atari, and NEC for infringement of his patent in the creation of their game consoles. While Nintendo, Atari, and NEC have all settled, Sega decided to take the matter to court. In a decision in April that may have been fueled by some rising anti-Japanese sentiment in an economically depressed USA, the jury awarded Coyle, now the lone stakeholder of the patent, $33 million, which the judge had the option of tripling, as well as the possibility of issuing an order forcing Sega to take all of their games off the market until the patent expired in August of 1992.
Okay, I have run across this suit in the past, and I don't fully understand, and I don't know if they did have to fully pay that $33 million. It is a strange patent. Yeah.
Well, and let's. I think we have to take this in two pieces. Number one, what actually happened in the suit, and number two, what the patent is. So, because I did find a source on what actually happened with that, allegedly based off of Sega's own financial reporting. So, just as a spoiler alert, they didn't pay the $33 million. They paid $44 million, and we'll get into why. But let's go back to the patent. So what was your understanding of the patent?
Well, as you sort of described, the idea was that you push through audio signals in particular, and it allows you to control elements on a screen. Now, there is in a very abstract way, when you are pushing something to a TV screen, you are going through a series of waves, which can be translated into audio signals. You know, it's like if you look at a wave on an oscilloscope, you will see these wave patterns going through an analog signal that goes to a TV. And that might be the abstraction that they were going for. The thing is, we don't have the decision of this case to look at. So we're kind of flying blind on what the argument was.
And this is one of the big problems, obviously, because it was a jury trial, as far as I can tell. And what I got from looking at the patent diagram, and of course all the links to all these materials are in the show notes, was that you would have an actual normal television signal, so a normal video signal, and then you would interrupt that video signal with the additional audio signals. So you would start with a video signal, then you would mix in these audio signals that would then make changes to the original video signal. And those then would make changes to the display. Now, what exactly that would be a translation to in the computer screen, my best guess, based off of what I've been able to conjecture, is that they're talking about the idea of overlaying sprites or something of that nature on top of a screen.
But here's the reason that wouldn't make sense for a patent filed in 1975. Sprites did not exist in 1975.
And this is where I think I think all the news articles are talking about the audio aspect of this. But what I think it comes down to is that they're really talking about you have one image and you overlay a separate element on top of that image. So unlike a normal television signal, which is a single bitmap, if you will, a single image, you're actually making up an image of multiple layered elements that are being processed at slightly different times and then mixed together into one signal that goes into the television set. That's my best guess because it's the only thing that makes any lick of sense. And there are some choice comments, including from Howard Lincoln, because this case does get mentioned in Game Over, where even Howard Lincoln is like, this case makes no damn sense.
Yeah, but as we will discuss with the Magnavox lawsuit in an upcoming special, the application of the technology, as understood by judges in this period, was extremely poor.
Yes.
And I mean, the weird thing is, like, a lot of patents are like specifically, yes, there are other patents that do this, but it doesn't apply to games. It needs to apply to games in order to actually apply in this case. And some judges go with that. Then there are some judges that are like, I'm taking the broadest possible application of this technology and allowing you to implement it over. But the thing is, that's also part of the lawyer's job to not let that happen, because a judge can't know everything. So the judge needs to be informed on a certain.
And this is normally where the appeals court would clear this up for us, both from a record standpoint and also from a get rid of the incendiary emotional reactions of a jury. Because, I mean, a lot of the news articles at the time are talking about about a series, not just this case, but there's been a series of patent cases in U.S. courts where Japanese companies have lost to U.S. patent holders. And there's even an article in the New York Times talking about how this really feels like almost like a war on Japan, like an anti-Japanese sentiment. Because remember, this is like the boom time in the Japanese economy. Everything's going great. They're taking over more and more stuff. This is around the same time that we get, them buying Rockefeller Center. And I want to say it was 91. There was even I remember a joke from Mad Magazine, these different dolls from around the world. And the one for Japan was, a Japanese businessman sitting on a giant bag of yen. That was the accessory for the character. I mean, it is clearly in the public consciousness at this moment in time. And so there's probably an element of that. But the real reason Sega ends up paying $44 million, not $33 million, but $44 million, is, and this despite the fact that John Kalinske, right after the trial, says, what? Tom Kalinske says he's immediately going to appeal. Almost immediately after that, they settle for $44 million because the fact that it could have been tripled is one thing. You still get to fight that on appeal. You don't have to pay it. But had the judge put in the injunction that they had to pull all their product from stores until the patent expired, that would have been a period, because I think this happens in May. In April. In April, the decision comes down. April to August, having to pull all their product just as they were basically taking, coming even, reaching parity with Nintendo.
That's next year.
But this is the period of time when they're really gaining steam. That would have killed them, because they're going to launch Sonic 2 for Christmas, and they just cannot afford to simply be no place for 5 months. And so they pay up $44 million just to settle this. And this gets quoted in several places. The lawyer for for Coil says that they had originally offered to settle for $2.5 million. Then in the middle of the trial, they offered to settle for $5 million. So obviously Sega thought that they could, muscle their way through this the way Nintendo has been doing with the Ataris, and it's just did not work out for them.
And Sega is going to lose another patent case to Atari in the very near future as well.
Yes, in 1994.
Oh, I thought that was a little sooner than that. But,
no, it's 94 because that's right before Atari ceases to be.
And if it was the opposing lawyer was using the fuel of anti-Japanese sentiment, that should have been something that the judge should have caught. Either way, I think we can both agree that it seems like a very dumb decision and not based actually on the parameters of the patent, but a very loose definition of what it's supposed to cover.
Exactly.
So, speaking of audio and Sega, Sega and Sony go all in on CD.
Sony ImageSoft has signed a new deal with Sega to publish games for their line of consoles, with a special emphasis on the Mega CD or Sega CD. This will, according to the press releases, bring Sony level production values. Sorry, guys. It will bring Sony level production values and film and music assets to the Sega add-on.
It's a weird thing to purely say that ImageSoft was, that the Sega deal was special because they were publishing on SNES as well.
This is true. They were publishing on Super Nintendo, but they are actually also going to get extra access. Like, for example, they're going to be publishing the Master System port of Sensible Soccer, which really has no connection to them. They're going to be picking up a whole bunch of publishing rights, and the interesting thing here is it's going to get them into markets that they normally wouldn't have been in. Like, they're going to be building up a publishing infrastructure all over Europe. Because remember, the Master System at this point is still huge in certain European markets. Spain and England, it's still a huge system. So by publishing these additional games, they're building their contacts with the high street merchants and with the different magazines and so on and so forth. So this is really going to give them an edge that I don't think they would have otherwise, but also a level of experience that is definitely going to come in handy when they launch the PlayStation.
The weird thing about it is how much crossover from ImageSoft there was to Sony Computer Entertainment of America, because it is a weird thing of how this worked out, because they're not the same company. Sony has a lot of very strange divisions. So Sony Computer Entertainment of America and its relation to Sony ImageSoft, anything that they could have learned from that is kind of a question, because it's not entirely clear.
Well, I like to always think that the reason we didn't get a make-your-own music video line of games on the Sony PlayStation is because they had the experience of knowing just how bad of an idea that was from the Sega.
I mean, one thing we do know about the Japanese reaction to the ImageSoft stuff is that they hated it. I mean, they hated everything that America did. Especially ironic because it was very, very helpful for them to be able to draw on that expertise. Sony ImageSoft and Sony Computer Entertainment of America were separate. They merged in '95, but by that time there was already starting to be a buildup of what would become the American and European strategy for the PlayStation. So yeah, that's the weird part of it. How much did they actually bring over? And certainly in the development realm, I don't think they really brought anything over, because it was the Japanese and even the British companies that had a lot more direct ability to add stuff like FMV to their games and whatnot. But there's certainly something. There's a strange continuity that exists in there. Their claims that like what they are building up is like, oh, we're bringing our Columbia Pictures expertise to these games. It's not true. It's not true at all.
You mean Sewer Shark wasn't?
Well, that wasn't even their game.
I know. But for me, Sony ImageSoft will always be associated with the bad console. Well, not bad. They were decent console ports of Hook, and the absolutely terrible make-your-own video games featuring groups like Crisscross. So it was like I didn't know. It was like Sillywood, but for the music industry.
Yes, there's. That's an interesting way to put it. I don't know how many other music companies really got involved with it, or if it was just Sony Bytes. I mean, there's the broader thing of like BMG and whatnot, but that's kind of after this period.
Well, I was also thinking there were several interactive CD projects based around musicians that were largely financed by their music publishers. Like there was that really terrible one with what's his name, the original singer from Genesis. What's his name? The Sledgehammer guy.
Peter Gabriel. How can you not know Peter Gabriel, sir?
I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep a lot of names and stuff. Okay, I called Kalinske John, for God's sake. So
he's not going to do an interview with you now, Carl.
But hey, I remembered the song, okay, and the dancing chicken, so that's got to be worth something.
Yeah. So, on the note of new technology coming to old consoles.
Yes.
Camerica announces Aladdin.
Camerica, purveyors of fine unlicensed NES goods, especially those coming from Codemasters, have announced the Aladdin, which they promise will revolutionize the way games are merchandised and sold.
It was just called the Aladdin initially?
At this point, all the press releases are just, or at least the write-ups in magazines are calling it the Aladdin. And they don't actually have any details about what the hell this thing is going to be.
So this is the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. Gaming historian Norm has done a video on it. Gaming Alexandria helped out a little bit on that. So that he goes very thoroughly into exactly what this is. And the short and simple is that within a cartridge, there are a lot of extra components that are more than just the game on the ROM. And that requires money to be able to manufacture and produce and put into every single cartridge that you're going to make. So they made a base cartridge that you could slot the basic ROM stuff into. So it was kind of a cartridge on top of a cartridge. All unlicensed, by the way.
Yes. And a lot of unlicensed games that were either ports of old Codemasters budget software from the ZX Spectrum days, or stuff that they had already previously released and now released in multi-cart form, etc., etc. is basically just, pointless, and for the NES, a system that is already on its way out.
I remember I almost bought a Quattro Sports once. I don't even have an NES. It was just shiny. I wanted to buy it.
And those games were actually kind of good when they were first released in '86 for a couple of pounds. But BMX Simulator, that was actually fun to play for a while. But it's by the time they come out on the NES
in 1993.
Exactly. No,
there was no more even official Nintendo NES games. Well, no, I guess Wario's Woods was 94 or something.
True.
But yeah, it was not a viable platform by then. Had this idea come along earlier in the cycle, it would have been a boon for unlicensed games. They might have even gotten more people on it if they had done something like that earlier. But as with Britain, as usual, they are behind the times.
Behind the times, and this is also part of a longer string of hardware announcements from Camerica for the NES. We've talked already on the show in past months about their portable NES that they've announced, and the CD add-on for the NES, or which would allow you to run games off of a CD using a standard CD player. None of those come out, but the Aladdin Deck Enhancer does.
Certainly, Camerica's games have their own certain look and feel. Oh yeah, speaking of look and feel.
Oh, nice transition. You prepared these, didn't you?
Apple loses GUI suit.
You're not going to tell me your trade secrets here, are you? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
On to the story.
Apple's lawsuit against Microsoft for copyright infringement of its GUI interface, first introduced in the Lisa and Macintosh computers, has been all but gutted by U.S. District Judge Vaughn Walker, who ruled that with the exception of the trash can, the symbols in question were too generic to be protected, and that Apple's notion that the work had to be seen as a whole was invalid as per precedent that dictated that the individual elements, sans copyrightable ones, had to be analyzed.
Gestalt theory does not belong in law, says the judge. Anybody who's been through a graphic design class knows what I'm talking about.
Exactly. So, now this case originally started back in '88. We didn't cover it because it was before the show started. First episode was November of '88, but we will get to it at some point, I promise. And the appeal in 1994 would be affirmed. So basically, the lower court's decision is going to stand, and Apple will then try to appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court will refuse to hear it. So this is going to be the law of the land.
This has obviously been, this is a very famous case in tech. This idea of tech and art and how copyrightable is the idea of an idea. And the look and feel thing, that quote there, was used as a legal argument by Apple as to why Windows infringed on Mac OS.
Yeah. And obviously there's also another lawsuit in the background from Xerox against Apple for infringing on their GUI. And I just briefly looked over that. I can't remember actually how that one turned out, but I think Xerox fails in that one due to some legal technicalities of how they...
Well, probably the big legal technicality is they didn't patent anything. They never established that firm protection on anything that Park was doing.
This is true, too. That's probably the grounds for it to fail, but I just glanced over it. There were too many stories this time, so I had to move on.
There's a lot of people forget that there are several intermittent steps between the Xerox Alto and the Macintosh. The Lisa is just one of them. There's a Xerox Star. There was even one before that. That was a commercial GUI system for mainframe use as well. And that is a continuing design story. Even the Alto didn't come out fully formed. There had to be the evolution of the idea, and the idea of Windows didn't even exist initially on the Alto. So there's a lot more to this narrative than what the simplistic view would have you believe.
Oh, definitely. I mean, even Sierra had a productivity package out in the early 80s, and 80 or 81, that had, word processor and a couple other things built into it, and the menu to choose from basically was a symbolic looking office space. So you clicked on the different icons to choose where you wanted to go. A desktop
metaphor.
Exactly.
Though it had been the idea had been implemented on Xerox by then. But, the idea of what can be owned versus what is simply an evolution in an idea. And that might be the reason why they didn't think they could patent this stuff. They were working off of earlier graphic design ideas that have already been implemented.
Yeah.
Okay, next story. Newton promises a consumer-friendly computer future.
Byte magazine is abuzz with the potential for consumer-friendly computing that Apple's new handheld, keyboardless computer, the Newton, promises. The ARM-based system with its handwriting recognition interface and multitasking OS could represent a future, muses the editor of Byte, that includes all home devices, including phones. He makes a big mention of including phones, which we won't recognize as computers, but very much are, even if they aren't programmable in a traditional sense.
Yeah, the Newton was... It's an early evolution of the PDA. Very specifically. I would you can trace the things back to the smartphone and whatnot, or forward to the smartphone, not back to. That's a weird way to put that. But the Newton had a lot of different capabilities that were mainly for business purposes. I would say the Newton is more related to the BlackBerry than to the iPhone. But the Newton did have a very high emphasis on cloud technology as part of its thing. That's what I think they're referring to in the not programmable in the traditional sense.
Actually, I was thinking not programmable because this is 92, and if you read Byte magazines of this era, there's still this weird leftover from the 80s, from the early 80s of, they're not talking to they're still thinking that you're buying a computer and you're going to write your own software. It's weird to think of it that way, but there's so many articles targeting that demographic in Byte magazine at this point.
But that's what they are. You know, they're not trying to. They've never tried to be a general consumer's guide to,
of course,
to that kind of computing. They are talking to programmers. They always have.
And this is why when they're talking about not programmable in a traditional sense, they're really it all. I don't want to say it feels like, well, this is what those non-tech people are going to be using, but that's really what they're talking about. It's going to be, these are devices that you're not going to get under the hood with. You won't be able to, the average person might be buying a PC, boot up Windows 3.1 and do their word processing and stuff without ever knowing how to write code on it. But you, our readers, would also use Word, but you would also, have BASIC running in the background or write some code or whatever else. And these will be devices where those functionalities will be locked out of this device. And I think that is that's the message that he's sending here to his readership. Even if you wanted to, you won't be able to write code on this thing.
This, people say that the Apple closed ecosystem began with either you can say the Apple III or the Lisa or the Macintosh. But this is really kind of the start of it. Like, you needed authorization to be able to write something for the Newton because they did so much in the cloud, because it was not supposed to be a super powered device in your hand.
Well, it was would have been technically impossible at this point in time.
Right. Like, you wouldn't have been able to fit that on there. But the concept, which kind of goes back to the Xerox thing we were just talking about, Alan Kay, he did not agree with this concept. He believed that you needed to have this concept of what he called guaranteed cycles on a device for it to be functional in the way that he envisioned. But there was a different idea that you could do everything up there in what is now the cloud, and they call them different things at this time. But your device is merely a terminal to get to the things you want to get to.
Yeah, and for a lot of people who remembered the old days of mainframes, that almost would have felt like a step backwards.
Yeah, time sharing is cloud computing. It's a funny thing.
Exactly, it's the same thing. I mean, I remember dumb terminals, and this goes back now because I still remember one of my favorite hangouts in Seattle circa 1995 was a place called Speakeasy, and it was a jazz bar / internet cafe. We're talking 95. And while they had 2 or 3 color Unix terminals, everywhere in the place they had tiny little black and white dumb terminals. Well, they weren't black and white. They were usually green screen dumb terminals that you could just log in and check your email or jump onto IRC on, and so on and so forth. And that was like the coolest place to be because you had this access, but they were just dumb terminals. Your traditional Unix dumb terminal. And I think that having a device where you didn't have the full access to the cloud, to resources, especially at this point in time before the internet is opened up, would have felt very, very compromised. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because the entire ecosystem wasn't quite there. Now, the Newton isn't ultimately going to be a huge success because the infrastructure isn't there. They had to do a lot of special deals with stuff like AT&T to be able to get this to even work to a reasonable degree. But the question on whether you need guaranteed cycles or not are still kind of an open thing in computing. But as you know, the Newton was the dumb terminal of its day, and it was portable. Yeah. And for people who were using it as a PDA, that was great.
And as the editor of Byte very well suggests, it kind of gives a glimpse of what the future will be. even if the Newton is not the future, it's not where it's going to go, it gives us this idea of this is what computing technology is going to evolve into, just something that is ubiquitous.
It is a future. The ubiquity, yes. But, again, as I said, whether or not all of our PCs are just going to become dumb terminals in the future is another thing.
Well, but that's the thing. He doesn't even mention the idea that it's cloud-based. He's just talking about the ubiquity of the computer, that, it's going to be in your phone. It's going to be in every device in the house. He's not envisioning a networking, or at least he's not talking about networking in his editorial. Curiously enough, that's where we focus on from our modern day point of view. But at that time, I think he's not thinking that that's really the key factor. It's
Nobody was. Nobody was until the internet appeared. Nobody realized it was absolutely not a priority. I'll tell you what was a priority, though.
Tell me.
Getting those freaking connectors on the back of your PC so that you can play PC games.
Beautiful. As the PC becomes a more popular option for gamers, getting game controllers attached is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. One company, Colorado Spectrum, is trying to help those that don't want to constantly have to reach behind their systems to unplug and plug in peripherals with their mouse yoke. The mouse yoke, all capital, is a flight yoke that attaches to your table and has a harness for your mouse, so that the yoke's movements will move the mouse, creating analog input for flight simulators.
That is a strange solution to the problem. But, I believe that the idea of this is to have a modular system that can do many different types of controller input.
Well, this one is very clearly just a flight yoke.
Okay.
It is shaped like a flight yoke. There's a link to it in the show notes. There's an old eBay listing where you can actually see it, and it is quite literally just the flight yoke, and a little bit of plastic comes off of it. You put your mouse in there, and when you push in on it, it pushes the mouse. When you turn, it turns the mouse. And that, if coordinated properly with the flight simulator, should give you a semi-accurate analog control.
But yes, back in the day, there was no such thing as a front-facing port. It just didn't exist. What you had in the front of your PC is whatever your input storage method was, whether it's CD or floppy disk.
And if you had a Sound Blaster card, you'd have a PC joystick port, but only one.
Yes.
And that Conix, the people of the Conix multi-system, they have resurfaced this month. There's a news report that they are releasing a PC add-on that allows for 2 joysticks to be attached to the system simultaneously.
That is the remnants of the multi-system. The thing that they put out is the controller that was going to be part of the multi-system. And
really?
It has joystick ports on it.
Okay, so it's not a standard PC joystick port?
As far as I can tell, the only thing that was ever put out with them was this standalone controller for PCs, which was the Conix multi-system thing, and it had the ability to plug in other joysticks.
Okay, no. Well, this report coming from a German magazine is actually just supposed to be an add-on card for the PC, made by Conix themselves.
Then I guess maybe it didn't come out. But that was one of the solutions. That was an idea of like, okay, we can put ports onto a peripheral device that can stay fixed in there semi-permanently. So even if they don't care about our controller, they can still buy it and then have easy accessibility to put in other different types of joystick ports.
A daisy chain, if you will, of controllers, 3D style.
And I'm sure that there's lots of connection things to worry about. But yeah, back in the day, unless you were an enthusiast who was buying like a MIDI setup, you had one joystick We have to deal with it. And whether or not that would even be read by the program was its own thing.
Of course. Yeah, no, getting joysticks to work on DOS computers was a freaking nightmare. And this is another advantage of being an Amiga user at the time.
Yeah, if you want to be locked into a very specific kind of thing. But Carl, you're a pioneer. We'll talk about something else pioneering. Columbus Anniversary brings out the Exploring.
A short-lived craze for New World conquest games has been sparked by the 500th anniversary of Columbus landing in the Americas. Several games, including a new version of Seven Cities of Gold, have been announced, most of which will either miss the day itself or just be very bad.
I forgot what the day was. I think it might have been August or something like that.
Oh, it's Jesus. This is one of those dates people should know, and I don't off the top of my head.
I actually saw it recently. I was looking at something. But regardless of it, the idea of the Age of Exploration, those kind of games were a little less popular by this time, because making them was kind of expensive. But, the derivatives of pirates were more popular in the late 80s and early 90s. I think that kind of stopped by then. I've never seen the new version of Seven Cities of Gold. I'm familiar with the old version.
The new version, I never played it. I remember the reviews at the time. It's basically updated graphics, but only limited updated graphics, because one of the things that they kept was the very limited scope of view of the original. So in the original, I think you can only see like 3 blocks ahead of you, 3 blocks behind and around. And so in the new game, they basically have all this real estate on the screen that's covered with decorative graphics for no other reason, to limit how far you can see. So on the original, I want to say the game was originally programmed for the Atari 8-bit, but I could be wrong there. It made more sense with the low resolution. It just looks awkward in VGA with that. And in addition to that, the scenes when you talk to a king or talk to merchants are now in an isometric graphic style, which doesn't really add anything to the game, and they've done no improvements to the game at all. So it's exactly the same game you got in the 80s, which at the time would have been in the 80s it was a great innovative game. By the time it comes out post Civilization and other games, it just feels really, really old, outdated, and gets ravaged in the reviews.
Yeah, Pirates was a refined implementation of what Seven Cities of Gold was. And both, they evoke the feeling of discovery and finding something new. And we don't really have games like that anymore, at least ones that aren't grounded. We have all these space games and whatnot. But I would definitely be down for something that was set in the Age of Exploration.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and by the way, I just looked up. It was October. But so we've got Discovery in the Steppes of Columbus, 1992. That game also gets ravaged in the reviews for the most part. Domark, later Eidos, they announced a game in time for this, which never appears. There is another game called Columbus later on that comes out in 1994 by Software 2000, a German company. That one gets mixed reviews. I mean, some people really like it, some people don't. It's quite plodding at times. And, of course, then later on in, I think, 93 or maybe it's 94, we get Colonization, which was a spin-off of Civilization, which pretty much does that whole Age of Discovery thing, but using a civilization.
Yeah, Colonization is quite interesting. Not quite as fun as Civilization, but definitely worth looking at.
It's definitely worth looking at. Obviously, the politics and the way to interpret the history of this is always problematic in these games, especially because one of the replacement for the 7 wonders of the world are the advisors for the independence of the colony, and one of them is, I believe, Pocahontas. So there's problems from a political standpoint there with that game, but it is still a quite entertaining game.
Let us explore some new horizons then, Carl. SSI plans for the future.
With its now aging gold box engine getting long in the tooth, SSI has begun development on a follow-up to replace it. The new engine will utilize TSR's Dark Sun universe and utilize an overhead view, unlike the first-person view seen in recent Eye of the Beholder titles.
Dark Sun is a very interesting setting. I actually just watched a video on this by Indigo Gaming. Definitely link that in the show notes. Gives a nice description of it. It's like Mad Max meets D&D. It's weird.
I actually played a couple of games in Dark Sun. It is a fun setting. It is very limiting if you're trying to, do a travel the countryside thing, because you really only have two environments. You've got a tiny hidden forest area in one corner of the planet, and the rest is just desert.
It is a hardcore experience, and that was definitely not what TSR needed at this time to increasingly get nicher and nicher. Because as Jimmy Mayer at Digital Antiquarian has noted, the Gold Box series basically kept selling worse and worse because they were catering more and more to the hardcore. This continued to be a problem for computer RPGs through the 80s and 90s. Wizardry is like the famous example where they just made it the worst experience for new players possible.
This is true. The Wizardry thing, we talked about that a few months ago in the 40-year jumps, or actually just last episode we talked about it, because the second scenario just came out for that. But the Gold Box engine is just getting old. It doesn't feel up to date.
Which is entirely fair.
But the Eye of the Beholder series is super popular. It is the thing that people want to play.
Yeah, the thing is that SSI was very good at finding outside developers, but they weren't good about tooling what they were doing internally. They were very much stuck in the old idea that kind of Joel Billings instilled it with, whereas Westwood was going out on wild, crazy ideas, and Eye of the Beholder obviously becomes a very popular series.
Oh, yes. When I interviewed Joel Billings, he talked about this. This new engine becomes a money suck. There's also pressure from SSI to use these new scenarios that SSI is trying to push to
TSR.
keep interest. Yeah, sorry. TSR, sorry. Yes, TSR is trying to push their new scenarios. This is why they also then do not only games in the Dark Sun scenario with this engine, but also the Al-Qadim world, which was sort of Arabian Nights.
There was the Al-Qadim setting.
Yeah.
And I really like these alternative settings, like Spelljammer. Spelljammer is weird.
They did Spelljammer, but with the Gold Box engine.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You should, if all you know about D&D is Forgotten Realms, please look up some of the other settings, because they're very interesting.
They're gonna try different stuff, but the engine is not great. It's not a good representation of the rule set. It's not as atmospheric. It doesn't have the variety that the Gold Box engine had with the first person views and then the tactical stuff.
Yeah, just to be clear, because you kind of skipped over describing the engine. It is top down. It's not quite in the same way as Gold Box, where it has a pseudo isometric perspective, so a little tilted like that. It's kind of straight on. You're like always viewing the characters very directly. It's framed like a Super Nintendo action game in a lot of ways, like Secret of Mana or something. But it is, and it's updated so that you can point and click to attack, so you don't have to do everything via the keyboard or the joystick. But it's not a real time interface. It is still turn-based.
And the graphic engine is running at 320 by 240 VGA. the art assets that they end up using, the tiles and stuff, they just look ugly as sin.
It is hard to make a setting like Dark Sun look really good.
Well, and this is the problem. This is why there was no reason to launch this with Dark Sun.
Yeah.
It should have been launched with Forgotten Realms. Hell, you could have even launched it with Dragonlance. But at the end of the day, it wasn't going to be the RPG experience, especially that players at that point in time were expecting. They wanted the immersive, and also at this point in time, we already have Ultima Underworld. And Ultima 7 is out. So both of those products put this new engine, leave it behind in the dust. And
in general, I do want to note that D&D was on a down curve at this time.
Oh, of course. Horrible mismanagement of by TSR. Yeah.
It will obviously recover, and through ebbs and weaves throughout the years. But people were looking for something beyond D&D. They wanted a new scenario, a new style, a new series. There's another new series coming out from another venerated computer game publisher. Sierra announces Scary Tales series.
In an attempt to move games closer to an adult audience in the multimedia age, Roberta Williams, of King's Quest fame, reveals in an interview in Computer Gaming World that their new series of games, Scary Tales, the debut entry, which has not yet been titled and is scheduled for a 1993 release, will feature a female protagonist and be a true horror tale.
This is, of course, Phantasmagoria.
Exactly, and it will be released in 1995.
I am certain that they dropped this series title.
Oh, yes, the Scary Tales did not survive.
Yeah, that was a bad idea from the start. It sounds incredibly silly, and, for something like Phantasmagoria that's very self-serious, wouldn't have gone down well for it to be under the Scary Tales series. If they made, like, horror-themed versions of Leisure Suit Larry or something, that would have been funny. But, this is Phantasmagoria, one of the biggest steps in the new multimedia age.
Yeah, and you can tell in the interview she doesn't talk about FMV. She talks about actors and she talks about sets, but she doesn't talk about FMV. And I get the distinct feeling that they weren't quite sure how far they were going to be able to take it yet. And interestingly enough, we already have games like the VGA remake of Police Quest 1 out, which use digitized images of actors. We've had, and Sierra themselves have published dynamics games like Heart of China, which also use digitized actors, but mostly in still images or very limited animation. So reading the interview, you really get this feeling that she's being cagey about what the technology of the game is going to look like, probably because they have no idea yet what it's going to be. And when I talked to Ken Williams, he also, talked a little bit, and he does it in his book as well. He talks about the long journey to making Phantasmagoria and the technical challenges of figuring out, okay, what can and can't we do here? So,
yeah, I don't know specifically about the development of Phantasmagoria to know if this really is a fully continuous through line with this thing, but it obviously I'll just say Phantasmagoria could not have been made if it wasn't a passion project, because they certainly cared about wanting to put out something that appealed to the more adult audience.
Definitely, they wanted that, and I gotta say, talking to Ken Williams, you get this feeling that he had, or has even to this day, a real, and the man has virtually no emotion on his face ever, which I thought, maybe that was just for photos. No, talking to him for like an hour and a half, no, that's just him. But he really does have this idea in the back of his head that computers are a tool for improving every aspect of human life, including entertainment, and that they are not a child's toy. And when you look at a lot of the publishing decisions he did make, they were basically, this is not just for kids. This is for everybody. This is, if you could have a movie studio that makes both, kids animated movies and adult psycho thrillers, why wouldn't you be able to do that with a games publisher?
We have another evolution of something that Sierra pioneered. the pithy little bit that Carl has put here. Help make a porn game. Yeah, thanks for making me say that, Carl.
You're welcome. Anytime. German porn star / entrepreneur Teresa Orlowski has decided to branch out into video games, announcing development of a point-and-click style adventure for the PC and Amiga. The story of the game will center around the mysterious basement spaces below her Hanover film studio. Or maybe not. GamesMag ASM has printed that her company's GamesMag ASM has printed her company's address as they are asking for the public's input on what the game should be about. Should it have an erotic element, or should it even be an adventure game? Everything is open.
Yes, everything is indeed open, Carl. Thank you for that ending little innuendo there. So obviously this is something that is more predominant in other cultures, like Japanese have a whole word for it. It's called eroge. I don't know if this was one of the first attempts to make something multimedia eroge, but I'm not sure how much I can really make commentary on a pornographic game.
Well, in this case, it is interesting. Teresa Orlowski was a big deal. She was almost a household name at this point in Germany. No. Well, okay, you also have to remember, Germans have a completely different relationship to pornography than Americans. Americans are basically prude. Oh, my goodness. Oh, you saw titties. Here, you go to a newsstand and you will literally see tits right next to the Mickey Mouse comic books. Nobody cares. So she was very big because she had established a chain of movies and other products under her label, because she had started out as a porn star. And she wasn't the only one. The other big company here that distributes porn and has porn shops and stuff, Beate Uhse, was also founded by a woman. And the idea that, she's going to get into the video game business isn't that big of an idea. The fact that she has no real plans and she's announcing this and saying, just send us whatever your ideas are, does make it sound like, we've heard there's chances of putting digitized images in this. How do we do that? And digitized images in things like strip poker games are not new at this point. The earliest one I can think of is Samantha Fox strip poker from like 1987 or something. But the product that ends up coming out, the only product I've been able to find, was the very creatively titled Pussy Puzzle, released in 1993. And it's, as far as I can tell, it's just a series of little mini game puzzles where you're putting together, naked pictures. It's really,
Gal's Panic, except on the computer.
Gal's Panic, Puzznik did something similar. So it's just that. But it is kind of interesting, just the methodology of this and the idea that it could have come out is kind of funny.
In other things that Carl finds interesting for his morbid curiosity, Street Fighter II is coming to home computers.
U.S. Gold has secured the rights to port the Capcom juggernaut to home computers. Yay?
I don't know why you have the obsession with these bad ports as if they are actually part of the game's legacy.
Well, as the proud owner of a box copy of Street Fighter II by US Gold for the Amiga, and somebody who has spent probably an inordinate or way too much time, and any time is really way too much time, with the C64 port of this, and has also played the Spectrum port, and actually built an entire website dedicated to all of the ports of the original Street Fighter II. That's still available someplace on Fortune City. I'll see if I can find a link.
Oh my God, Fortune City.
Yeah. There's so many typos on that page. It's scary. But yes, I find these ports absolutely astonishingly interesting. For a variety of
Interesting,
reasons.
giant air quotes, just so we are clear.
Well, yeah, I look at them both from an artistic standpoint, because there is this, how do we interpret this? The ZX Spectrum version, for example, is just, it's abysmal on every level, but for whatever reason, they've added in these objects in the background that are clearly in the background, these little poles, and literally you can break these things when you hit and stuff, even though they're in the background, so you shouldn't even be, it doesn't make any sense. But it exists. And the fact that it exists, that somebody got paid to port these, probably in almost no time flat, is both, I don't know. It's
horrendous and horrendous. Those are the two words you're looking for.
It's an interesting little historical footnote. And it's also
yes, the entirety of Britain is an interesting historical footnote.
You can't look at it that limited. I bought the game when I was living in Germany, for example. So these were distributed everywhere. I mean, everywhere these machines were available. I still remember there was a write-up about it as a preview in Video Game and Computer Entertainment magazine in the States for the Amiga version. So there you go.
Okay, we're getting past this because I can't stand to think about this anymore. I haven't even seen the port and I don't want to think about it. So from the fighting games to the beat 'em ups, Double Dragon movie announced.
TradeWest has made public that a Double Dragon movie is in the works. Together with the Mario Brothers movie that is on the way, no doubt at least one of them will have to be good.
I think that it was a greater tragedy that the Double Dragon movie is not at least watchable, because there's no reason it should have been that bad. It makes no sense. It's such a simple idea, but they just made it convoluted for no reason.
Why it's set, in this weird post-apocalypse and all this stuff, it doesn't make any sense. But okay.
I mean, and same thing happened with the Mario Brothers movie. It was just something in the air. It's weird. Like, everyone wanted to be Blade Runner. It was 10 years. 10 years later, everybody was trying to be Blade Runner.
Well, you also have to look at it, I think, from the standpoint that the multimedia craze of, you had to have a cartoon and you had to do all of this. You couldn't just leave a simple plot and do big action. That just wasn't going to be an option. Have you ever tried to read the Double Dragon Marvel comic book?
Why the hell would I even go near such a thing, Carl?
Because it's actually an interesting forerunner. It comes out a couple years before this, and it's only I think 4 or 6 issues. But it changes it. It tries to create a world around this license. And I mean, it's been done before. If you look at, for example, I can't remember the guy's name, but the famous writer who did the early Donald Duck comics. Very famous comic book artist. Can't remember his name right now, but he had to do something with Donald Duck. He was supposed to do a comic book about Donald Duck, and in the cartoons, Donald Duck is just this guy who gets easily angry and starts yelling. You can't build a story around that. So he reinvents Donald Duck into this very mild-mannered guy, and bad things keep happening to him, and he's always stuck in a bad situation, and either money problems or his girlfriend doesn't like him or whatever else, and he's always just trying to make ends meet. And then he builds an entire world, the Duckburg universe, around that new character who, other than his appearance, has nothing to do with the cartoon version that keeps being produced simultaneously. So this is what's happening with these properties, and it's considered an acceptable practice at this time that when you go to a different medium, other than the name and maybe the look of the characters, there's no reason to keep any other aspect of the IP the same.
If you want a good Double Dragon movie, go watch The Warriors. Speaking of needless sci-fi, the Lawnmower Man promises to do for VR what Tron did for video games.
Or at least what Tron was supposed to do for video games. The CGI spectacle based on a Stephen King story has been getting massive coverage in the video game press as the amazing visuals and hopes of VR gaming to come look enticing as hell to those still gawking at Mode 7 graphics. Sadly, just like Tron, the movie will get pretty dismal critical reviews and be little more than a footnote in cinema and pop culture history.
I didn't know it was based off a Stephen King story.
Oh, yeah, it's based off of a Stephen King story.
My God, that guy. What hasn't he written? Oh, my God. And two, this is a truly horrible movie. Lawnmower Man is not worth visiting unless you really need to know what people thought about VR in 1992.
Oh, come on. There's a monkey wearing a laser tag helmet and harness. Do I need to say anything more?
I wish we could not say anything about this, but it was the vision of what a digitized reality could be. It brought the Neuromancer to life. I don't know why they never made an adaptation of the Neuromancer. I mean, it's kind of a weird thing to do as a movie, but either way, the idea of cyberspace and VR and what you could achieve with 3D graphics that would look horrible the next year when Jurassic Park came out. It was a transition phase. A lot of people forget about it. A lot of people think 3D just appeared. But in between Lawnmower Man and Tron, there were definitely changes.
Yeah. And we can't forget that wonderful Def Leppard video that came out in 92 as well. What's it called? Wanna Get Rocked. Have you ever seen this?
No.
Oh,
I listened to that one album by Def Leppard and I was done.
No. This is Wanna Get Rocked is a ton of CGI, and it looks terrible by modern standards, but I remember watching it and rewatching it over and over and over again because it just looks so damn good. Now, granted, it's like 6 years after Money for Nothing, but it felt like, oh, this could be a real virtual world. This could be something, that you could do. So it's very, very pathetic. And then, of course, we get Jurassic Park, and that just changes everything.
The Abyss. The Abyss is really cool.
The Abyss is really good, too, for the, 2 scenes where they actually use CGI.
And then Terminator 2.
Oh, yeah, but that was just, the silver morphing. It didn't...
But that was great! It's amazing! Anyways, let's not get sidetracked on the movies. There are changes coming to the game industry as well. Probe abandons computer game development.
UK developer Probe Software has announced that they will be abandoning all home computer platforms to concentrate on console development. Studio head Fergus McGovern explains that they've, quote, been looking at the market and the need for games currently resides 95% within the consoles area, end quote. He doesn't rule out porting some 68,000 base games to the Amiga when it makes sense, which they will do with games such as T2, the arcade game, and Mortal Kombat 1 and 2.
They were not acquired by Acclaim yet, right?
No, they do those ports for Acclaim.
Right.
And they then get, I don't know exactly when they get acquired. I talked with
Greg Fishbach.
And Greg Fishbach about that and the purchase. But no, I don't believe at this point they don't belong to Acclaim yet. They're still basically making their own decisions. But yeah, there's only going to be a handful of Amiga ports that they still do. After that, they're all console all the time.
He's definitely wrong about the idea that 95% of games were in consoles. I couldn't give you a number, even for this specific time period, but more in the range of 80% was the market.
Yeah, and I'm sure he's exaggerating just a little bit, but yeah, I mean, it's just the revenue being generated is so much greater in console that, the copying, this is really the big problem. The copying, the piracy in the PC realm is just too big.
It was bigger in the early 80s, I would say. It's always been a problem. It always will continue to be a persistent problem. But it was less of a problem than it was earlier, because it was just like people need to be educated. And this has been said. It's just like people needed to learn about, and it wasn't even necessarily they don't copy that floppy, but it's just the idea of buying PC games, which a lot of people just didn't know that you did because they just got these stacks of floppy disks in their back drawer with little labels on them.
Well, I mean, on the European platforms, it was really, really, really bad. I mean, horribly, horribly bad. There was so much piracy. Now, granted, I actually still own original copies of T2 arcade game, Mortal Kombat 1 and Mortal Kombat 2. But, it's one of those things where I'm not saying that the original copies of those games were not pirated. I did buy the box copies new later on, but I didn't buy them when they first came out. And so it's one of those things. It was just really rampant in Europe. I mean, it was you hear all these stories from the UK of kids exchanging cassettes and stuff on the playground. That's what it was. I mean, you'd go over to a friend's house with a giant box under your arm with 100 discs in it, and you just sit there for
now before we break
the
Carl's statute of limitations.
Yes,
let's get to some more changes. Lucasfilm Games becomes LucasArts Games.
The new name will first appear on the company's Star Wars tie-in X-Wing Flight Sim, which has not been named yet, but yeah.
The great name. It just feels good to say LucasArts. Something, people never say Electronic Arts. They just say EA nowadays. But LucasArts has this special power as a name.
Well, it's interesting because I tried to confirm that X-Wing was the real first game with that name on it. And Super Star Wars does mention LucasArts, but LucasArts was not originally the name of the games division.
Right.
They had spun off the sound, VFX, and game division into their own sub-company called LucasArts. And then the VFX and sound divisions were spun off into their own company, leaving the only division left under LucasArts being the game division, and that's when the game division becomes LucasArts. So this is why if you look at the box on Super Star Wars that comes out before X-Wing, it says LucasArts on the back. It doesn't have the LucasArts logo because it's not LucasArts Games. It's LucasArts, I think, Inc. or Corp., which is still that umbrella organization.
Regardless, it is a beautiful moment.
Weeds on that one.
Well, I appreciate it. I enjoy myself some corporate finagling.
Well, see, I still prefer Lucasfilm Games, and I'm glad they're back to Lucasfilm Games again.
Nah. LucasArts is the one that fills people's spirits, and people will continue to refer to them even before they were LucasArts as LucasArts. No, for me, throughout the LucasArts period, they were still Lucasfilm Games to me. But then again, I played Labyrinth, so. And that inspired you to continue. Anyways,
Yeah.
Next story: Microprose buys Vector Graphics and Paragon.
Leeds-based Vector Graphics, the company.
No. Vector Graphics.
They're an English company. It's just even though it's spelled with a K and an X.
Yeah.
And an F, it's still Vector Graphics. The company that converted Atari Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back to home computers, as well as developed Activision's Fighter Bomber and ImageWorks' Killing Cloud, have been bought by Microprose, who will release their upcoming B-17 Flying Fortress and Dogfight games. Microprose has also purchased Paragon, maker of less than stellar comic book licensed games such as Doctor Doom's Revenge, The Amazing Spider-Man, and X-Men, and the Mega Traveler series. Many of the principals of the company will leave in 1993 and help form a little company called Take-Two.
Need to stop you there. They did not help form Take-Two because the only founder of Take-Two, as far as I'm aware, is Bryant.
No. This is where it gets weird. He's not the only founder. It's and I'd have to look up his name again, but the founder of Paragon is the co-founder of Take-Two as well. So it's those two guys together basically form the partnership. They started together. Now, it could be that on some Take-Two paperwork someplace only one founder is mentioned, but in the interviews that I look through, they talk about both of these guys being founders of Take-Two.
The press
and then
can be
about
dumb.
20 people from Paragon come along to help start the company.
Anyhow, I'll look this up and see if we do need to have a Department of Corrections thing
There you go.
on this. But the one thing that I found interesting about Vector Graphics is they did conversion of Vector Graphics games for Atari. But it should be noted that Atari Star Wars came out in 1983, and their port was in 1987.
Well, there's two ports onto home computers of the original Atari Star Wars arcade game. There's one that was done by Parker Brothers, which does not use actual vectors. It's using sprites for the TIE Fighter.
I mean, you couldn't do vectors on any computer system.
Well, not
you're confusing this again, Carl. You're about to say that lines are vectors.
Okay.
No.
Yes. But they were just using standard sprites. The old Parker Brothers version, which appears on the Atari 8-bit and Commodore 64, maybe also the Apple, can't remember, is very similar to the Atari 2600 version of the Star Wars arcade game. But the Vector Graphics conversion is much closer to the actual arcade game, with the ships flying around you and everything else. Now, the frame rate, especially on the C64, is abysmal. The Atari ST and Amiga versions are actually really, really good with mouse control for the cursor, so it actually plays much more smoothly. Granted, if you go back to it today, the frame rate is not what you would hope it was. But back in the day, I mean, when 3D graphics were not expected to be at 60 frames a second, it was more than very playable. I spent a lot of hours on that game. So
now, do you have any concept of what Microprose is going for here with buying Vector Graphics and Paragon? Like, what are they filling that they don't have?
When I talked to Wild Bill Steely, he's got two problems on his hand. Number one, Europe is a major market for Microprose games, and the European market basically chews through new product very, very quickly. So while in the U.S., due to the way that the market is set up, a game can be a major hit for quite a while, or you can leave it on a store shelf for quite a while before it has to get pushed out. And so it can find a market. In Europe, you basically got all your sales, or virtually all your sales, in the first 4 to 6 weeks, and after that, you're off the shelf and replaced with something else, no matter how great your game is. And so he actually told me in the interview that his European operation was constantly pushing him for more product. This is how they start the micro style sub-label that publishes stuff like Stunt Car Racer because they just needed more and more product. And in addition to that, he's now running into a big problem this year. Namely, he was supposed to have a bunch of internal product done, and he tells the story about how he had these MBAs come in. They were supposed to manage the company, and he took his first real vacation. When he comes back, he finds out that the MBAs gave the developers more time, pushed their deadlines back. They weren't going to make Christmas, so there's several big products that miss the Christmas season. And he starts buying up these companies to fill that void. He needs product for the Christmas season because it's been promised to the retailers. Because of the way the retail chain works, that if he doesn't have product, he's going to be in a problem. Now, Paragon was already publishing their work through Microprose's, what do they call it again? It's the same thing EA had where they were
affiliated label.
Affiliated label. Thank you. So Microprose's affiliated label program, I think it was called Micro. It wasn't Microplay, but it was something similar to that. So all these games that I mentioned, these Marvel licenses and Mega Traveler, have all been published or distributed at least by Microprose. So they already have an existing relationship. They're coming in. And they have product already in the pipeline that is supposed to come out this year, like Twilight 2000 and Mega Traveler 2, I believe, is also coming out this year. So by bringing these companies in, Microprose, basically he's trying to salvage the expected earnings for the year by having enough product to satisfy the shareholders.
And ultimately creating bloat.
And that, especially because most of these products aren't very good, these games are getting very bad reviews for the most part. And Dogfight's going to be a disaster. It's basically doing the same thing Birds of Prey did, the Argonaut software game where it's like, 100 different airplanes, all from different periods of time, and there's no game there. And on top of that, it's slow as molasses, and it's not working right. Blah 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 blah. And also remember, this is coming off of the fact that earlier in the year they basically tanked the very expensive arcade operation. They did Bots, and before that they did F-15 Strike Eagle as an arcade game. Both of those cost millions and were huge losses. So, and Microprose is now finally getting onto the NES. They have F-15 Strike Eagle for the NES came out in the 12 months before this, and they're going to try to get a couple of products out onto 16-bit systems, but it's all happening way too late. And so right now, Microprose is in a financial tailspin, and this is where he tells the story that, he's going to be in Vegas, and one of his managers is going to have to talk him off from jumping off the side of the building because he's literally going to consider suicide because he has basically run the company into the ground. And that's going to lead, I believe, the next year or the year after that to the merger with Spectrum Holobyte.
That might be a Wild Bill story.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It really feels, when you look at the actual moves, everything, we've reported on Microprose so many times in the last 12 months, and it's always bad news. And these moves right here match up with what he said about having to fill a gap.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I was saying to the last part that you just said.
Oh. I don't know. It's the idea of, and the way he described it was the idea of, having to face these people, the employees and everything, and tell them, most of you aren't going to have a job. You're basically screwed, and so on and so forth. Kind of makes sense.
Anyways, in their console strategy, what they should have done is they should have made a version of Civilization for the SNES to capitalize on SimCity for the SNES.
They did.
Oh, they
there
did?
was a Civilization on
Oh,
Super
I don't even
Nintendo.
remember this. Oh, God.
Oh my goodness! Yes, no, they ported it. They didn't do it.
Well, they should have
themselves.
made it in. They should have emphasized the Nintendo style, like the SimCity on the SNES did. That's my solution to save Microprose in 1992.
Yeah, the problem simply was that they did not have the infrastructure in place to be a console publisher at that time, and with the money losses that they had, the upfront investment for that kind of development was also harder and harder to organize. And they're going to keep pushing through more PC product. I mean, Paragon is going to make BloodNet in 1993 or 1994. I can't remember.
Whatever the hell that is.
It was a point-and-click adventure game that was vampires in a cyberpunk setting. It's actually quite a good game, as long as you play the CD version. If you play the disc version, they exercised a bunch of the graphics, and it doesn't really work as well. But the CD version is quite good.
So Microprose was a company that was screwed over by its IPO, but here's a company that will also eventually be screwed over by its IPO. The Learning Company goes public.
The edutainment giant behind such hits as Reader Rabbit and Super Solvers, as well as the amazing Rocky's Boots, has gone public, raising $22 million in a fully subscribed IPO. This new funding will be used to develop new products using emerging technologies.
$22 million is good today for an IPO.
No, $22 million is not good today for a tech company IPO.
Well,
Please.
but
there's a digit missing.
You have a very broad definition of what a tech company is for a game company like this, which they did not really consider a tech company.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you that.
Still one. So yeah, 22 million, very, very good. The Learning Company, very complicated history. You've gone through some of the later stuff when Mattel acquired them and whatnot. Reader Rabbit was apparently the first game that I played. I don't remember it, but it was I think a DOS or Windows version of Reader Rabbit. So that's my sole connection to the Learning Company. They are definitely a very interesting company that had a monumental rise and quite a collapse.
Oh yeah, definitely. One of my earliest games on the C64 was Rocky's Boots. Actually, one of the only original games I had on the C64 early.
Created by Warren Robinett.
Exactly, and it is very interesting. Not only because you manipulate everything with a cursor, so it feels very much like a GUI interface. But it's also an amazing puzzle logic game, but all within the confines of electrical circuitry. So it actually is teaching you to read an electrical circuit board on how the different interrupts work and stuff, and you have to build these devices. What's the name of the old cartoonist? Rube Goldberg. Style devices out of these different connectors to essentially every level or virtually every level. The goal is to activate this boot. So you have to get an electrical current to the boot, and the boot then will then shoot forward, and it has to kick a ball. And so you have a starting position of the boot, a starting position of the ball, and then you have all these pieces lined up at the top of the screen, and you have to move them down and put them in the right order so that you will be able to get power to the boot to kick the ball.
Incredible Machine before Incredible Machine.
Basically, yes. And at the same time, you were learning how to be an electrical engineer. It's really a cool learning tool.
I remember there have been a couple games that try to teach programming in that kind of way, where they extrapolate programming into in-game things that you can do. And that always seemed to me like it could be a very interesting evolution in games. But a lot of the stuff that the Learning Company did was strictly curricular. It wasn't really that creative. Even the stuff like Reader Rabbit, or not Math Blaster, that was Davidson and Associates. But yeah, a lot of their stuff, it was very specifically edutainment and not entertainment that happened to have educational elements.
Exactly. And I mean, Rocky's Boots, at the times when I was playing it quite obsessively for quite a while, I didn't even know that those symbols were actual symbols from electrical engineering. I just thought, well, that symbol means this, and this symbol means that. And I was just learning as I went along the mechanics of this particular abstract game. I was not actually aware that it was something from the real world. I learned that many years later.
There's a lot we can learn from early attempts to meld entertainment and education. But we are on to our last story. And Peter, why aren't you here? Carl has given me a blessing. For a company is going away. Adlib files for bankruptcy.
The company that popularized the PC sound card business has filed for bankruptcy. It couldn't keep up with competition from Creative Labs' Sound Blaster series of cards.
Yes, Adlib was probably the first truly popular PC sound card add-on. Because if you don't know, back in the day, the internal PC speaker was all you had. You did not have the ability to connect to external speakers and have the CPU run all your very neat sound little things. You needed a card that played MIDI or played a particular custom sound file thing, and Adlib was one of the first. And of course, you got the joystick port with it, as we mentioned towards the beginning of this. And Adlib was a little less widely supported. Like in the end of the 80s, it was the most popular, I think. But I think immediately Sound Blaster took over it, like when you got to the 90s.
Yeah. I mean, by the time you get to 91, 92, Adlib is still usually an option in the menu.
Yeah.
Just like EGA is still an option, but it is not the preferred method of listening. Now, there were a lot of games that got criticized for the Sound Blaster option just basically being the Adlib option again, where there wouldn't be much of a sound improvement.
But that was part of the thing about having a Sound Blaster, is that it could play Adlib.
Exactly. And that's the thing. If you had a Sound Blaster, you could also play games that only had Adlib. But if you had Adlib, you couldn't play the games that only had Sound Blaster or had enhancements for Sound Blaster.
Just like buying a Hercules card.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing here is that in this month's magazines, Byte Magazine is reporting on their bankruptcy. But there's other magazines, a lot of the game magazines are actually still reporting that Adlib's new card, the Adlib Gold 1000, is still coming out. It's been delayed, but it's still coming out. Now, if you read the Wikipedia page, and always take that with a huge grain of salt, one of the reasons for the delay of the Gold 1000 was that even though Yamaha was making the sound chips for both Adlib and Sound Blaster, for some reason Adlib's chips were not passing certification tests at the same rate as Sound Blaster's Yamaha chips. Now, it could just be Yamaha had a preference for one company over the other, but for whatever reason, the chips weren't coming fast enough. That delayed the new Adlib cards, and that could have been the saving grace. I'll take that with a huge grain of salt because the Sound Blaster is just such a powerful force on the market at this point. If you look, for example, at the very popular one-page ad for Wing Commander back in 1991, what you'll see at the bottom when they say preferred preferred hardware, not requirements, but recommended hardware, it actually lists Sound Blaster. And I know my buddy Danilo actually bought his first PC based off of, he just took that ad into the store and said, this is the machine I want. Whatever these recommended specs are, that's what I want to have. And so that's why he ended up with the Sound Blaster card. Not because it was cheaper or anything, but because that's what Wing Commander wanted. And so I think that was probably a huge component in the move to the Sound Blaster cards.
I mean, you had to make deals for this kind of thing. No one was just going to buy a Sound Blaster for the sake of having one.
No, of course not.
And so, so Adlib got outplayed in that sense. But, they also didn't provide the product that they needed to at the right time. And if you're someone who only was alive in the graphics card era, this exact same thing happened with 3DFX.
Yeah.
So it's a story that keeps on repeating. It's if you don't make the right moves in a very competitive market, trying to sell into a limited market, because you can only sell one of these per machine, basically. Except to the highly dedicated people who upgrade their.
Wait! I'll take this back. I just messed up. My memory is faulty. I looked up the ad just to be on the safe side. No, it says Adlib and Roland Sound. It's Adlib and Roland on there. I take it back. I'm going to correct myself before we even get out of the starting gates.
The Roland it was the ludicrously expensive option because it was basically a MIDI controller. It wasn't really a sound card. It was meant for people who were making music. But it did sound real good. So Adlib, it was very versatile. It was the cheapest option on the market for a while, but it is no more.
It's going to get a little bit of a second life. It was originally a Canadian company. A German company is going to buy the assets. They will release some Adlib branded cards for a few years. But yeah, the company itself is gone, and the brand is really of no significance moving forward.
Okay. So, we have come to the end of the show, Carl.
Yes. So there's only one task left. The intrepid co-host must now choose the word of the episode.
I'm going to ad-lib it.
Oh. So are you? So what is the word then?
Adlib.
Adlib. Okay. A fitting farewell to a pioneer whose time in the limelight was all too short. But since we've made so many references to Blade Runner today anyway, I will go out with the candle that shines twice as bright, shines half as long.
Isn't that a Neil Young quote?
Possibly, but it's actually much older than that, but it shows up in Blade Runner. That's when Tyrell is talking to...
the Tears in the Rain speech. We all know it. Carl.
No, the Tears in the Rain speech comes much later. This is the one where they've shown up at Tyrell's apartment in the main building, and he's like, make us live longer, and he's like, I can't, because and then as consolation, Tyrell is
okay. We're going off on spoiling Blade Runner. Bye, everybody.
Oh, come on. It's a good movie. It's a great movie. It's one of the greatest movies. Okay. Okay, everybody. Remember, sign up for the Patreon. Sign up for everything else. All the links are in the show notes. If you have any questions, comments, anything else, send us an email. And, of course, give us a thumbs up, 5-star rating, whatever else in your podcast app of choice. And help spread the word if you can. If you have a podcast, hey, invite us. We'll show up. We'll say hi. It's all good. Cross-promotion. Something. I don't know. Okay, guys. Have fun.
Bye.